Fewer than 24 hours after Donald Trump abruptly paused all U.S. military aid to Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling his Oval Office spat with the president regrettable. In a new post on X, he reiterates Ukraine's commitment to peace, writing, quote, "None of us wants an endless war." He adds that Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table. And although Zelensky doesn't use the post to directly apologize to Trump, as some White House officials have argued he should do, he did express his gratitude for U.S. support, something he has done frequently, including during an address to Congress the first time he visited the United States as president of Ukraine after Russia invaded the country. White House officials say the pause in aid will stand until President Trump determines Zelensky is serious about working out a peace plan and a path to end the war with Russia. Losing assistance from the United States, especially its Patriot missile defense system, could have dire consequences for Ukraine. The Prime Minister of Ukraine says it's the only tool the country has to protect itself from Russian ballistic missiles. Joining us now to discuss is retired U.S. Army Major Mike Lyons. Sir, thank you so much for being with us. Right off the bat, what is the effect of this pause in U.S. aid to Ukraine on the battlefield?
Well, Boris, I don't see any positive outcomes from this change here. I think tactically, I always look through the eyes of the soldier and how they view this. And I think if they get this news at the front lines, they're going to be disappointed in the United States. I think right now the front lines are focused on drone warfare as well as artillery fire and artillery ammunition. So if you're a cannoneer on the front lines, you're looking at that pallet of ammunition behind you, wondering if it's going to be replaced. So I think in some ways, the tactical implications are somewhat limited, and they might not be impactful for, let's say, the next few weeks. But over time, as air defense platforms degrade and they shoot missiles down and they're shooting things down that they're not being reinforced there, I think there's going to be real problems with the Ukraine military trying to keep up to what's going on.
To your point about seeking that next pallet of ammunition, how much longer do you think Ukraine has to sustain that artillery and ballistic missile defense without U.S. help?
Well, they likely have months, not necessarily weeks. And as again, they've built some defenses up themselves. But what will happen is Russia will look to go on the offensive and try to break through in certain areas and weaken Ukraine defenses and force them to play economy of force missions and to reinforce areas where they might not want to. It'll clearly keep them on the defense. We just also know specifically what this means, the fact that we're not giving military support. You know, you've got European soldier commands training Ukrainian soldiers in Vilsek and Grafenwehr and places. Does that mean that training stops for them as well? What about intel? What about other things that the United States has been providing? So again, there's a short-term impact. What will happen tactically on the ground? Obviously, we know the strategic impacts over the long run. Ukraine would be able to sustain any kind of defenses against Russia if this lasts very much longer.
How far do you think European backing, the EU's backing, can go without that backstop of the United States?
Unfortunately, the European industrial base, it won't crank up fast enough to help Ukraine. It's going to take a year or so in order for some of the more advanced European defense contractors to provide any kind of material that will help Ukraine. The United States has the war footing right now with the amount of artillery ammunition that we're supplying with them. It's increased over the past few years, and Europe won't be able to backstop that. So that's where there's a race against time right now. The United States needs to continue to support Ukraine, at least right now for these negotiations. Look, Donald Trump doesn't know whether Russia wants to stop. He knows he wants Ukraine to stop. He knows he wants the war to stop. But we don't know whether he knows Russia wants to stop. And I think this mineral deal will help put in implied security assurances for Ukraine. But the question is going to be, what are Russian demands in order for Ukraine to stop? They might be too much. And perhaps this will cause this administration to turn around and send more military aid to Ukraine as the Russians still have a voice as to whether or not this conflict will end as well.
Major Mike Lyons, appreciate your point of view. Thanks for joining us.
And back to our top story this hour, Donald Trump's suspension of all U.S. military aid to Ukraine. That includes critical ammunition, advanced weapons, as well as military vehicles. Most significantly, it also includes Patriot air defense missiles. Those US-provided weapons have been a game changer, really, for Ukraine, allowing it to protect its skies from Russian attacks. Now, Kyiv is saying it could run out of them just in a matter of weeks. Europe is scrambling to adjust to this new reality. The EU is pledging a new $150 billion loans program to help countries in the bloc boost the defense spending and increase their support for Ukraine.
One impact, what else are we likely to see?
In a word, I spoke to a U.S. military official. The word is devastating. So start with munitions, artillery shells, which had already been an issue for the last several years, getting enough in given the consumption of the shells on the front line. But even bigger is air defenses because Russia is continuing and even expanding its onslaught through the last several weeks and months. And the Patriot missile system, the U.S. Patriot missile system, is the only system Ukraine has that could shoot down ballistic missiles from Russia. They have other systems that could take down drones, which are slower moving, etc. But for ballistic missiles, some of the deadliest, that is only the Patriot could take it out. So they begin to run out of the missiles that supply those air defenses. The next level, which will be devastating, would be the loss of intelligence sharing, because the intelligence sharing goes in both directions. One, it's about picking your targets on the Russian side to push them back, but it's also overwatch as you're watching all these weapons come in. Without that, Ukraine is at an enormous disadvantage. And then the final one is morale. I've been hearing this both from Ukrainian officials and Americans for some time, that as they feel America abandoned them, and that is how they view it. I had a Ukrainian officer message me this morning calling it a betrayal. The folks on the front lines who are already suffering are wondering, if America doesn't have our back, am I a sitting duck out here? Right? Does that begin to break down cohesion on the front lines? It's a genuine concern.
Look, it's a proud people, but they are so vulnerable, and they can only take so much. So where does this move, Jim? Where do you see it fitting into sort of the evolution that we've seen among some Republicans especially?
This is a much bigger shift than just Ukraine. Ukraine is one piece of it. And we should note that this is not entirely new, right? This will be the third time Trump and/or Republicans have suspended military aid to Ukraine with impact. Subject of the first impeachment, 2019, Trump suspended it because he wanted to get Zelensky to investigate the Bidens. You'll remember the House GOP waited 6 months to add aid, and now we have this again. And by the way, that 6-month pause had enormous impact on the battlefield. They felt it, and it took them a long time to get back to it. So this is a string that shows you that Ukraine is not a priority for this president and hasn't been for some time. The thing we have to be conscious of, it is not just Ukraine that he is signaling moving away from. It is Europe as a whole. And look at his public comments, right? You got to do more on your own, which is a fine position for an American president to take. But the way European leaders are taking this is that the U.S. will no longer protect us. We are on our own. You hear that from the chancellor-to-be in Germany, right? That we cannot rely on the U.S. to defend us as the U.S. becomes more aligned with Russia and Europe, which is a remarkable statement to make. But these moves together put us closer to Russia's positions on these issues than our own treaty allies. That's a remarkable development.
It really does seem that way, at least in terms of negotiating an end to the conflict inside Ukraine. Jim Sciutto, great to see you in person. Thanks so much.
Ukrainians woke up to the news this morning that President Trump is cutting off all military aid to their country. This is just days after his clash with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This ban applies.
Well, she's joining us from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv right now. Nick, is there a sense of panic in Ukraine over this U.S. decision?
Yes, in the shortest possible response, Wolf. Although there are bids to put a brave face on this, ultimately this is the key part of Ukraine's military assistance being pulled away, and the most important sophisticated bits. We're told from Ukrainian source that intelligence sharing is not impacted. That's vital for Ukraine to know what their Russian enemy is doing. But what is going to be affected, possibly running out in a matter of weeks, and we know Ukraine counts them day by day, are Patriot air defense missiles. They're the only thing that can shoot down Russian ballistic missiles that hammer Ukraine almost nightly. That is key, and also by May, June, if not earlier, critical artillery ammunition will likely run out as a result of this decision. Now, I'm sure the Trump administration will defend this and say this is about pressuring Zelensky towards a peace that's yet to entirely have been defined. And also, too, I think there are other suggestions here that we weren't likely to see a further injection of finance from the Trump administration. This is simply Biden administration aid being held up. But still, real shock here, Wolf.
And you have to ask, trying to pressure him maybe on the deal, but also could this add pressure on Zelensky to possibly step aside as Ukraine's president, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, as we've been reporting, the technical aspects of replacing a wartime president here in Ukraine basically make it impossible, or would render a sense of political chaos that would just make the prosecution of the war by the Ukrainians almost impossible. But yes, it adds pressure on Zelensky and that personal rift. And Zelensky has a very hard choice now. He essentially seems to be being asked by the Trump administration to publicly apologize for the Oval Office incident, which they consider to have been his fault, to sign a rare earth mineral deal, which doesn't contain security guarantees that Ukraine needs, but does hand over much of Ukraine's wealth potentially for years, and also commit to an unspecified peace but from the Trump administration. We don't know exactly what peace Trump is asking him to sign up to. Is it the peace that he is negotiating with Moscow, of which we know very little and in which Ukraine is not involved? Is it the peace plan that the European partners are putting together for Trump? Or is it a general sense by the President of the United States that the President of Ukraine is more willing to talk peace? That's a very difficult ask for a wartime commander. And on the other side, the plus of acceding to this, well, Ukraine would potentially get a continuation of aid that it thinks may run out anyway in the months ahead. It vitally needs those patriots and intelligence, though, Wolf, Pamela.
Very quickly, Nick, before I let you go, have sirens been going off in the capital of Kyiv, where you are, with Russian drones and other attacks coming in?
Yeah, look, this is nightly. I mean, for many nights while we've been here, we hear the air defense working here to shoot the drones down. Some nights there are over 200. The last few nights there have been just about 100. But this is attacking all across Ukraine. Civilians are being killed by this on a quite regular basis. And that's away from the hundreds that die on the front lines every single day. So be in no doubt, the pause in this aid will have very real-world consequences on the number of Ukrainian lives lost in the months ahead.
Like, what we're seeing here is just Ukraine scoring a massive PR victory over Trump, because they're again looking like the adults in the room, right? You'd think that if anybody, and reasonably so, if one side was a bit more loud, bombastic, it would be Ukraine, because they're dealing with an existential crisis, and the United States, isn't, right? Like, they're supporting an ally, but, they're not the ones being invaded, right? And so it's quite telling that the sober, mature, even-keeled, clear-headed person is the one representing the country on the edge, and the nut job is representing the powerful country that doesn't have as much at stake. And it really does demonstrate that Trump is siding with Putin, because it's no coincidence that as, Ukraine gets its funding cut, Russia launches a new offensive. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that Putin and Trump had a meeting where it's like, you do this and then I'm going to amp up my invasion. But the thing is, we don't even need that. Trump didn't need to do that. He didn't need to have a special secret meeting with Vladdy, when in reality we know that everyone in the world saw what happened over late last week and over the weekend. But it's also a sign, what's happening with Canada and Mexico today, that the Ukrainian side is winning, Zelensky is winning, because it demonstrates that it's not just Ukraine Trump has a problem with, it's any democratic country in the world.